Hello and welcome back to the Bandwich Tapes. I'm Brad Williams. On today's episode, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with the incredible William James. Will is currently the principal percussionist of the St. Louis Symphony, a chair that he won when he was in his early 20s. We talk about that audition process and what it takes to prepare, perform, get called back, and eventually land the gig with a major symphony orchestra. We also talk about his daily schedule, assigning parts, preparing equipment, rehearsing, and then performing with the ensemble. It's a fascinating conversation, and you'll gain a lot of information of just behind the scenes of what it takes to be a performer in a major orchestra. I really had a good time talking with him, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it too. So here we go. Here's my conversation with the incredible William James. Good afternoon, Will. How are you today?
I'm great. Glad to be here.
Well, I appreciate you using your day off to hang out with me and talk about music. So thanks for doing that.
Absolutely.
You know, it's funny. I was thinking about the fact that I started this podcast to stay in touch with a lot of musician friends of mine, and you're actually the closest person in proximity to where I live to anyone that I've talked to. So it's kind of nice to talk with someone in the St. Louis area.
Yeah, we can talk restaurants and traffic and tornadoes, unfortunately, this year.
Yeah, I know, man. It's been brutal. Especially the Central West End area was really hit recently. It was rough.
It is rough. Depending on when this comes out, it's mostly, I think it's announced. I'm not stepping on it, but we're doing a benefit concert on Sunday. It's either the 29th or 30th. I can't remember the date of June. The Fox is donating the facility and we're donating the production costs. And so I don't think the program has been announced, but if you buy a ticket to that concert, every dollar of that ticket will go to relief for North St. Louis churches that were affected.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Well, thanks to you and the other members of the ensemble for donating that. That's fantastic.
Yes. So it is a good cause for sure.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, man, the podcast, we talk about all kinds of things with music, and I've talked with just a little bit of background for me. I spent a lot of years in playing commercial music as a bass player, singer, drum set player, but my beginnings were in classical and orchestral percussion. So that's kind of where my heart and passion is. And so any chance I can talk with a percussionist like yourself that's out there, paying the bills, playing, I always want to kind of pick your brain and just kind of hear about your journey. So that's, my listeners vary as music listeners to musicians themselves. So I'm sure they're going to get a lot from your story of what you've done, because you've had quite a career playing percussion.
I've been very blessed and fortunate. As I say often, it's better than actually working for a living. So yeah, and St. Louis Symphony has been a great gig, and happy to still be here.
Yeah. So in looking at your bio, I've read that you won that chair as a 25-year-old. Is that correct?
I was. It was December 10th in 2007. And I was still 25 at the time and started that September of 2008 I was a member of the New World Symphony at the time. And for those that don't know about the New World Symphony, it's very analogous to the minor leagues in baseball, where it's a professional orchestra that typically accepts postgraduate musicians, but you only get a 3-year contract. It is designed to have turnover. You are not supposed to be there as a career position. And it's sort of a bridge between your educational life and your professional life. And it has worked very well. It has an incredible success rate. We have multiple, not just percussionists, but string players, brass players that were members of the New World Symphony that are now members of the St. Louis Symphony. And it's a great organization based in Miami Beach, which is not a terrible place to live in the
Not at
winter.
all.
Maybe not the summer, but in the winter, it's a great place to live. And so, yeah, I won this audition in my second year there. And so I didn't even have to sweat out the third year. I moved here.
Wow. And yeah, there are players all over the world that were members of that orchestra. I mean, it's placed people everywhere.
Oh, literally everywhere. Yes. It has an unbelievable track record. I'm blanking on the year it was founded. I want to say in the 90s, early 90s, sounds right, but I could be off on that. But tremendous track record.
Yeah. Is Michael Tilson Thomas, was he connected with that orchestra?
So he's founded it and had lots of connections down there. And it's an interesting business model because their annual budget is very low because they house the musicians and they pay them a stipend, but it's a very low stipend because basically your only expenses is food and travel to auditions. You don't have utilities. So it's a very low annual budget orchestra. But they just built a new hall that opened. I played the groundbreaking, but the hall didn't open until after I left. So it was probably open in 2010. And they have like essentially a dorm where they bought a building, an old hotel, and made it into studio apartments. And so, yeah, great organization.
Wow, that's awesome. So what was the audition process like for you for St. Louis? Was it multiple rounds and lots of performing?
Absolutely. It was very typical to any other audition. This was certainly not my first. My resume got me into the preliminary round. But so many people apply for these positions that you have to have a reasonable resume just to be able to play in the prelims. So yeah, because of and I have learned this after the fact, but because of the way the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra's hall sort of operates, they spread out the preliminary rounds over several Mondays. Like I said, Mondays are day off, so the building is available. And then those that advanced came back for a separate Monday a couple weeks later for a semifinal and final round. So I think there were somewhere in the 80s and 90s of people who played the prelims, maybe 25 to 30 people a day over the course of a couple Mondays. And then I don't remember the exact numbers of semifinalists, but you're probably looking at 18 to 20 made it to the semifinals. And then there were 2 of us in the finals that advanced out of that 18 or 20. And the other guy is working. He's the principal percussionist of the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, D.C. So It's not like it hasn't worked out well for him either.
Right.
But it's a very different skill than playing in the orchestra, but it relates incredibly. it's obviously very similar because you're playing repertoire that you would be playing with 90 other people, but you're playing by yourself. So
Right.
there is an adaptation to how you approach it because you don't have those 90 other people.
Yeah.
But you know, it was a fairly standard list, very long. They want to know that you have all the skills necessary to play the actual job. Sometimes that gets lost. Of you know, people approach it sort of like a recital, and that I'm just gonna play everything as good as I can. And in reality, it's really just a test of, do you have all the skills to play what the actual job is?
Right.
It is not a performance. It is a test for sure.
Did were there any moments during any of the rounds where they asked you to change any interpretations or anything just to gauge your flexibility on the fly?
Oh, for sure. Way more so in the finals. So for those that aren't familiar with the orchestral process, audition process, the prelims and semifinals are blind, meaning that there is a wall or screen between the committee and the applicants. So they have no idea who you are. They're judging you solely based on what you sound like. And then in the finals, in St. Louis, the screen comes down so they can see you and interact with you more. In some orchestras, the screen never comes down. They're choosing applicant one or applicant two. They have no idea who they are, which makes it incredibly fair. But in the finals, you know, it is after having hosted auditions since I've gotten the job. It is very important to get that sort of personal interaction, because that's how you're going to actually work with these people.
Right.
So in the finals, there was a lot of interaction. David Robertson, the music director at the time, conducted me through an excerpt. Even though I was playing by myself, he wanted to sort of see how I could adjust to someone conducting me through some passages. And we did some section playing where we sort of alternated playing bass drum cymbals and triangle or snare drum, and played through some ensemble passages, just the three of us, to see how that felt. And we'd play through and then switch parts and then play through. And then even with just solo excerpts, there was definitely some, could you play that a little faster? Could you play it a little bit softer? Could you make these musical adjustments, because that's really the gig is, you have to adjust to those around you, and if you're incredibly stiff and inflexible, like, that can be a warning sign.
Yeah. Well, and you had been playing obviously previous rounds, but you're also playing in a new hall, right? And you have to adjust your touch and your approach to the instrument based on the room that you're in, and every
Totally.
conductor is different, right? So then they may
Yes.
want that passage to be this tempo or this volume level, while this conductor may be completely different, right? It requires a lot of flexibility.
Well, and that's a great point, because you can't, there's no way to predict that. So you have to come in and play the way that you think these passages should go and give your best foot forward. But knowing that, and I tell people this all the time when they're preparing for auditions, is they're not going to ask you to play something again if they don't like it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
a lot of people freak out if they say, oh, could you play this a little slower? Or could you play this a little bit softer? Because sometimes that's literally just a test, like, can you do it? And sometimes they might know some things about the hall that you haven't picked up on in your 10 minutes in the room,
Right.
versus their hundreds of hours. And so they're just saying, hey, like, does it sound better if I ask them to play it slower?
Yeah.
And so I always tell people, if they're asking you to do something different, it's because they want to hear if you can do it. If they have already not liked it, they're not going to ask you to do something
Right.
different.
Yeah.
They're looking at their clocks like, when is this going to be over?
Yeah.
So, there is a big strategy element to preparing, each excerpt, because you want to represent, like, you as a musician, but also knowing that there's sort of a range that you might need to fit in. Um, if you, let's just say Scheherazade is an incredibly popular orchestral piece that has lots of percussion in it. Listening to 10 different recordings of Scheherazade and what are the range of tempos. And, let's say one or two of them are outliers where they're incredibly slow or incredibly fast. You toss those out and sort of what's the average? And then what sounds best by itself versus with 90 other people. Sometimes 90 other people can drag the tempo back because it's like pulling a train with 90 cars versus one. And so you sort of do that mental assessment of, well, I know this is how a lot of recordings go, but if I play it 3 clicks faster when I'm by myself, it sort of represents the piece better because I'm not having to drag. And maybe that's too harsh a term, but it's sort of accurate. I'm not having to drag 90 other people along.
Right.
And it can go the other way of where, the orchestra can be like really shot out of a cannon, but you miss some details when you're playing by yourself. So like actually, 4 or 5 clicks slower makes it the clarity better with some excerpts. So there is definitely a strategy into approaching, how you prep all that stuff.
Yeah. As we're recording this, I don't think Powell Hall has reopened yet. Is it close?
It is incredibly close. We are playing an acoustic rehearsal in, I think, 3 weeks. That is literally just that. It's for us to go in and play. We're obviously not preparing the music for anything, but it's, has it changed? Is it, just sort of to get our brains wrapped around what is going to be new. For those that don't know, our home is 100 years old this year. Powell Hall was built 100 years ago, and while acoustically is in an amazing space, the infrastructure was 100 years old.
Right.
And had not had really a significant renovation since the 60s. And even that was just sort of enough to adapt it to a concert hall. And so this has been over 2 years, but almost 2.5 year project of updating the infrastructure, expanding the lobby, expanding backstage, and updating all the HVAC, electrical, everything.
Wow.
So the goal is that the auditorium will remain as unchanged as possible, but there'll be new seats, and like they did plaster and paint repair, and they shifted a couple walls around for some logistical lobby stuff. And they had to replace the stage floor because if they sanded it again, there would be no more wood left to sand. So, there were some changes, but the goal was to try and not change the space as much as possible. And so we don't really know what we have until we play. So we will reopen with our regular season in September. There's a lot of aesthetic work that has to still be done. But my understanding is if all the chairs aren't installed, they're very close today for all the new chairs to be installed, which is over 2,000 of them.
Right.
Because that'll affect the sound. I know the stage floor is down. And part of the reason we're having this acoustic rehearsal is all that stain and clear coat has to dry before we get on it. So, we're very anxious to get back in our home. It's been a long 2 years of not being at home.
Right.
But back to our earlier conversation about, acoustical, tendencies, we're very anxious to, hopefully it's largely the same.
Yeah. Do they have any intention to make any adjustments to anything if the ensemble plays in there and it sounds wonky or it doesn't sound the way it should?
I think if needed, it will not be something and those sorts of acoustical tunings, they don't happen. It's like, oh, we'll just move this wall,
Right.
It's a process. And quite frankly, I don't think that will be necessary. It will be different because it has to be, the old chairs are out, the new ones are in. the stage floor is different, even though it's the exact same wood, put down exactly the same, inevitably it will be different, whether that's 1% different or 5 or 20% different, even the experts will tell you they don't know. Um,
Right.
so the hope is that it is largely the same. Whether that will require any sort of additional tuning to the space, we will find out in about a month.
Right.
But that can happen over the long term. The infrastructure updates, the lobby expansion. There'll be a rehearsal room that we can use when we need to. That stuff was the bit. That was why we did this project.
Yeah.
The building was going to start having some serious problems in the next decade if we did not address, some of the infrastructure needs, but also just the audience experience and our experience backstage of getting ready. I could walk off the stage and be at my car in like 25 steps. That's not a big backstage.
No, it's not.
Um, so we'll have a proper percussion room where we can store everything, and if we want to switch cymbals or switch triangles, we can just run backstage, grab it, and be right back. And I mean, we did have space in the old hall, but it was all scattered in various closets and various places, so it was not organized like at most places. So it will be it will change our day-to-day life tremendously.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, there never seems to be enough storage for the percussion
Yeah.
equipment. And I was going to ask if they were going to increase that for you, but that's really exciting to hear that it will be more centralized than it is now.
It was, and the planning for that, I remember it was probably 4, maybe even 5 summers ago, talking to our operations manager about the planning of this and like the reality in my head of, if we need X, like we need to decide that now, because if we don't decide it now and it's not in the blueprints and the planning for the budget, like it won't happen. And
Right.
so I literally designed the percussion room over the summer. It was probably 4 years ago. And I was like, oh, like I'm not going to see this for 4 or 5 years, but yet
Right.
it's critically important now, these decisions. So
Sure.
we did an inventory, or updated our inventory, I should say, and it was like, okay, what has to be on the ground, what has to be on the first shelf, and like just sort of worked our way around the room from there and designed it.
Yeah.
And I've been in the space on a hard hat tour, and it's going to be amazing. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How much of your day-to-day schedule with the orchestra would you say is actually performing on stage, and how much of it is like logistical work, like part assignments and equipment preparation, and how much of that is like the administrative part of the job?
It's a big part of it, and it has taken more time and effort because we're essentially a traveling roadshow right now.
Yeah.
You know, if we need a slapstick for a concert, that's something we don't need every week. And so it's like, all right, trunk 124 needs to come because that has the wind chimes we need and the slapstick. And, that would be something that I just never would even think about. It would just like, oh, I'll go backstage and I'll grab it and we'll walk on stage and use it. So yeah, and I mean, that's just one example. We've come up with systems and a trunking system so that, I can just tell the crew, hey, we need these trunks, and they'll be there, and the instruments we need will be there. But, there's certainly, it is an added level. But back to your original question, I'm probably 40% of my work time is actually playing with the orchestra, and then probably the other 30% is practicing and preparing at home. Maybe 30-40% is actually like playing the instrument at home. And then, another 20 or 30% is studying, doing part assignments, laying out the diagram of how we'll set up, because I may have to share an instrument with someone else, so we need to be close to each other. And um, but that is certainly a you know, noticeable amount of time. I do need a desk, despite being a musician, to sort of
Right.
lay all that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things that I think as we go through as performers, and you don't think about the administrative part of the job that could potentially come with it as well, that it requires a lot of organization and keeping good notes of, this is how we did this last time, or this is how we'll do it this time, and
Yeah.
making sure that you have all that information available.
Oh, for sure. And it is a part of the job, and I'm a pretty type A person, and we've developed Google Docs and shared stuff that makes that communication pretty easy. And I can look back and, yeah, like, what did we do in 2012? And
Right.
use that as a guide. It wouldn't be something necessarily we just copy every time, but it does help. It does help.
Yeah. Do you have particular conductors that prefer a particular pair of cymbals or a particular snare drum for this piece, or do you have to keep notes like that as well, or do you just kind of have?
I actually, it's more like if we get, with the music director, we see them a lot. Yeah, I've worked with David Robertson a lot, and now Stefan Deneuve, and so, like, we've learned things that he prefers, and we will lean in that direction. Me personally, I actually try not to do stuff like that, because I find that it's like, well, this is the snare drum I use for Shostakovich 10.
Mm-hmm.
And that squanders creativity in my experience, because I may play a Shostakovich 10 7 times in my career, and if I just use the same drum every time, that's not I'm not using big ears. I'm just sort of like, well, this is the way it works. And I may end up with the same drum, or I may end up with a similar drum, but I always try and go prepare each concert cycle like it's the first time. Now, I will certainly rely on experience for sure, but with mallets, of like, this is the mallet I use for American in Paris in the opening every time. And even if it's in the same hall with the same orchestra, the balance changes, and
Right.
a conductor will want things slightly different, and so you should use your ears and adjust. And it makes part of what I think is great about playing in an orchestra is that it is like capital L live music. And our ears have to be incredibly attuned to what's going on. And even night to night, it will be different. Now, it's hard to change mallets night to night, but certainly on different concert cycles, it's just going to be different. And reacting to that and sort of embracing it, I think, is really healthy. And, it makes a long career new every week, as opposed to, well, this is the pair of cymbals I use for Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, because it's just going to be different every time. It may be very similar, but it's going to be different every time.
Yeah. Well, that's, and as we were talking earlier about preparing excerpts, I mean, it's like, it's a living, breathing thing, what you're doing. And to be able to, you want to remain creative in what you're doing. And yeah, and not, you want to be a musician and not a technician, right? And just kind of
Yes.
recall what you did last time, like, like a, like a machine. No, you want to be able to be open to how everyone's feeling, because yeah, different personalities and it's going to change, and it will require a different approach based on what's happening at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, when I joined the orchestra, John and Tom were in the section, and they've both since retired. And now I have Alan and Kevin. And so, we've had, that transition, and it's not good, bad, or indifferent, but it's not good or bad, but it's different,
Right.
They're different players, and we chose both of those players for a reason, because they're amazing. And so, it would be doing the orchestra a disservice if I, told Kevin, hey, you need to use these symbols because Tom used to use those symbols.
Right.
That would, I could say like, well, these symbols sound great, try them and see what you like to use them for. But if I squander his creativity, then that's going to make the overall product lower.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, looking at your bio, I see you're from the great state of North Carolina. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, just north of Atlanta, so we grew up pretty close
Oh yeah.
proximity. Um, how did percussion come into your life? Did you find it, or do you think it found you?
I mean, it's probably a little bit of both. I did a couple years of Suzuki violin when I was pretty young, and I think that was, positive, but I wouldn't say it was something that I like changed my life or anything. And then I played piano for a few years, played all the sports, played baseball, basketball, soccer, um, tennis, a little bit of golf, and just that sort of scattershot approach that we're now using with my kids. Of, what do you
Right.
like? Here's
Right.
here's a lot of opportunities, and did swim team and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But in middle school, I remember, like you could pick an instrument to join the band. And I wanted to play percussion. I was always sort of drawn to percussion, but at the middle school I went to, they sort of, to ensure you could read music and at least have a basis of musicality, even though I had already played a little bit, they wanted you to start on a wind instrument. So I played trombone for the first 4 months of my sixth grade experience, and then I guess the second semester I moved to drums and was, played drum set, did, the typical band route through music, middle school. And it was a really just sort of slow progression. It was not, I didn't really have that click of like, oh my gosh, I have to do this the rest of my life. And I don't think that was a bad thing. I think it was just, I slowly started playing less sports, and doing more percussion related stuff. And, by the time I hit high school, I think I played tennis my first year of high school. And then after that, it was like all percussion.
Yeah.
Um, and, I think that was good, to have, I mean, we're sort of doing that with our kids now of, we have friends who play like almost year-round baseball already, and I'm like, your kid's 7, like that's just like
Right.
way too early.
Right.
So I think, yeah, but our kids are doing piano, and this year we allowed my daughter to decide whether she continued with piano or picked a different instrument, or just I didn't want a break, and she picked to do violin through school, and that's been a great experience. And that was sort of my experience of like the scatter shot of lots of stuff, and then um, percussion. I just kept going, and I and I'm sure this is the case with lots of people. I had a great high school percussion teacher, Bill Pendergrass in Raleigh. It was great. He taught a lot of really good percussionists, and he was a good, resource and great teacher to sort of like get me to like a higher level. And then it was really on me to practice and take it all in. And there's a funny story that there's no way this would happen in 2025, but in the 90s, somehow it did. I went to a small school that didn't really have like a marching band, and it had a good music program, but just not like a big program. And I started hanging around him because he would teach at like a local bigger high school, like their marching band. And so my junior year, I just started like hanging out and helping. And over that summer, they were like, well, do you want to like do our band camp? And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, like, this is what I want to do. So I just attended their band camp that summer. I didn't pay $1, which is like would never happen today.
No, it would not.
Um,
That's awesome.
and they were like, "Well, do you want to like play the season with us?" Because it was a competitive marching band. And I was like, "Well, yeah. Like I'm not doing any sports." And so I literally just it was like I just walked on the marching band
Oh, that's great.
and played the whole season. Had a great experience. Made a ton of friends, and it was great. But I look back now of like that just would never happen today. I mean, imagine like a basketball player who didn't actually go to the high school, like, oh, I play at this high school
Right,
and I'm playing on this basketball team. It's essentially what I did.
right.
It's
We'd
easier
be
to
seeing that on the news, right?
well, it's easier to blend in when there are 150 people on the field, but
Right.
it was a great experience. But it just would it would never happen today.
Well, and I'll say that, I don't think the state of Georgia will come and get me now. Yeah, I used a family member's address my senior year of high school to go to a larger school that had a bigger music program for
Sure. Yeah.
that purpose. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it yeah, I don't think those things can happen as easily now maybe as they did back then, back in the 90s when I was in high school.
Yeah. I mean, you did at least did it the proper way.
That's true. Did you do any summer music programs when you were in high school or in
Yeah, I mean,
college?
I did a few local ones, and then the summer between my junior and senior year, I was like, hey, we got to start looking at colleges, and is this really what you want to do? Do you want to try music? And Northwestern had like a summer, I think it was, gosh, was it 4 weeks? It might have been 4 weeks. It was an extended camp, maybe somewhere between two and four. I can't remember, but I got in, and Michael Burrett is the professor there, and he did a lot of percussion ensemble stuff and lessons, but then you also played in orchestras and bands, and the full experience, and that was like really transformative, and the reason I wanted to go to Northwestern.
Yeah.
And my parents really bought into it because if I went and music, I sort of flamed out. A degree from Northwestern is a pretty good piece of paper to have, in music or anything else.
Right.
So I definitely applied other places and did other things, but that was really what sold me on the university and their program, and certainly Michael Burrett himself. I mean,
Absolutely.
in our industry, you go to college for the professor, not, maybe 10% of it is the university, but 90% of it is who you're studying with.
Yeah, absolutely. I did 2 summers in high school at Brevard,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is in North Carolina,
I know
and then
exactly where that is.
yeah, and then I did 2 summers at the Chautauqua Institution in New York. That was a really fun program,
Yeah, I did
also in high
one
school.
summer at Chautauqua, and that was great. I remember they had an opening in their professional orchestra right around the time my wife and I were getting serious and engagement was coming, and she was looking at me like, "Do you think you want to leave me like, at home with a potential family for the whole summer?" And I was like, I guess this is like when I have to start making different choices."
Yeah. Yeah. Man, it's such a beautiful area.
It is.
It is so beautiful there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you did that, and that was in because when I was there, they still had the high school division, but I don't think they have that anymore. I think it's just college.
No, I think I went in the early aughts. This would have been '01, '02. And if they had a high school program, I don't remember it.
Yeah.
um, it was an orchestra focused program,
Hmm.
and I don't know if that was really what drew me. When I went to college, it was just I want to do music. It was not
Yeah.
orchestra, and doing stuff like that helped. But really, being in Chicago, seeing the Chicago Symphony probably every other week,
Oh, yeah.
and getting into the Civic Orchestra Chicago, excuse me, was, I mean, that's really what sold me of like I could see myself doing this. This is awesome. You know, I I enjoyed playing with other people.
Yeah. What was the experience like studying with Michael Burrett?
I mean, he's great. I don't, I mean, I'm sure other people will have, you know, opinions about other professors, but I think he's the best at preparing you for capital G general percussion of
Hmm.
just you're going to be good at everything. And then from there, it's you've got to figure out what you want to do. Um,
Yeah.
Great chamber music musician. He teaches chamber music really well of how to prepare and how to communicate and all of that. You know, obviously great marimba soloist. You know, he teaches the solo repertoire really well, and is a sneaky good, you know, orchestral player. I don't know if many people are going to like go directly to him to say, you know, like prepare me to get into an orchestra, but like very good orchestral player and prep of the repertoire, and was the exact right teacher for me at the time because
Yeah.
you know, I learned so much about just percussion from him, and that allowed me, you know, are we going left, are we going right, are we going straight, you know, that allowed me to choose which direction I wanted to go with a really good core behind me.
Yeah. My son just finished. He majored in percussion at LSU and studied with Brett
Yeah,
Dietz,
with Brett.
who's a also a former student of Michael at Northwestern.
Yeah, Brett was doing his doctorate at Northwestern when I was there.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
that's
so
cool.
I mean, we overlapped at least one year. I think I think my junior, it was at the end. I think it was both my junior and senior years we overlapped.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I first learned about you through seeing the work that you put together for the repertoire,
Hmm.
which is incredible. Which I think you found this thing that was missing in the percussion world, and it it's first of all, I applaud you for doing that, and I can't imagine the amount of time and energy it took to put all of that together.
It
And
was a
and I'm just
lot.
curious. Yeah, I can't even imagine. And I'd love to hear about kind of the process that led to that, and then how you managed to put all of that together.
Yeah, you know, I touched on it with the Chautauqua thing. This will be a roundabout way to answer your question. You know, when my wife and I got married, I was still teaching quite a bit. And, you know, I would play concerts on the weekend, and then I'd sort of have a night of the week that I'd teach several lessons. And all of a sudden, like 3, maybe even 4 days of your week, you're just not around. And so my wife and I looked at each other like, is this the life we want to live where I don't see you half the week? Because she has a full-time job. And it was sort of like, I don't think this is like what we want. So I kept teaching the students I had, but I just stopped taking new students. But I still wanted to teach, and I still wanted to be active. And the thought of doing like some recording projects came up because I can do that sort of whenever. You know, when she's at work, or if I have a day off from rehearsal, or even a week off, you know, outside of the actual recording session, like the day that, all right, on Tuesday at 1 p.m., we're recording, that was really the only black and white time commitment.
Yeah.
The rest of the prep and everything else could happen on my own schedule and wasn't happening at night when, you know, I wanted to have, you know, start a family and actually be present. So, you know, I thought about doing some recording stuff, and then I kept going back to, you know, a lot of my friends in college were brass players, and they have all these like trumpet excerpt CDs and horn excerpt CDs. And, you know, that was 25, 30 years ago, but, you know, video is so, I wouldn't say it's easy, it's easier. And percussion is so visual. It was like, well, why don't we do, um, you know, like an excerpt video series? And I became super friendly with John Parks at FSU, and he does a ton of percussion recording. And he was like, this would like blow up. This would be amazing.
Yeah.
And so we sort of came up with a plan of like how to record it. I came up with a master list of, here are the most commonly asked excerpts. It's certainly not everyone, because, if one orchestra once asked for an obscure piece of repertoire, like that list would be even more daunting. And we just broke it down to like what we were doing in the orchestra. Like we did some of the John Williams Escapades, which is a big vibraphone excerpt with saxophone. And so we were doing that in the orchestra. I was already learning it. And it's like, okay, like the next week, let's record that and like 8 other vibraphone excerpts. And so we sort of planned, what we were recording based on what I was preparing.
That's awesome.
So, I mean, that's the reason we recorded Escapades at the time period we did, because it's like, well, I already have to learn it for the orchestra. We might as well, lay it down while it's in my hands.
Right.
And so it took probably 2.5 years to record everything. And we probably averaged like a recording session every 9 months or something. And, John would fly up, we'd do a recording session, and, it was like, all right, we're going to do, all the accessories this time. We're going to do tambourine, triangle, cymbals. And then like, all right, let's do all the snare drum in a session. And so we sort of broke it down that way. And then the really labor intensive thing was, I wanted there to be like tutorials where here's a 9-minute video of me talking about Scheherazade and how to prepare it. And again, like this was all stuff that I could do on my own time. I could sit at a computer and I'd write a script of like, okay, here's what I want the video to look like. Here's what I'm going to say. And, slowly, we did all that. I had a backdrop in my basement with lights and a camera. And every once in a while I'd like read, the scripts out of a teleprompter for a couple hours and slowly stitch it together. And, it was a nice way to feel like that I was educating and creating something that I could leave without sort of massively, it's certainly disruptive, but not massively disrupted like my personal life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible. And I would imagine, and I'm just thinking in terms of myself, I would probably feel more hypercritical of the speech piece of it than I probably would the performing piece of it.
Oh, it's awful listening to yourself talk.
I've learned that doing this podcast.
Sure.
By the way, I'm like, oh man, I don't want to hear myself talk anymore.
Well, and I wrote it in a way that would be conversational because I knew I wasn't writing it for like an article.
Right.
So I wrote it in a way that would sound like I was speaking. But still, I would do 2 to 3 takes of every little paragraph because there'd be an or a stutter or something wouldn't come out with the flow of how I wanted to communicate. And that was the really big challenge of this was I could play something and it would be great, but like it would be 2 clicks faster than like I really wanted it. Mm-hmm. And in an audition, it'd probably be no one would notice. But because people are going to be like rewinding and listening to it over and over and over again, stuff like tempo was like incredibly important because it's like, no, this is what I'm telling you is like my ideal way of playing this.
Yeah.
And so if something wasn't exactly the way I wanted, it's like, well, we've got to get it exactly. So many people focus on like, oh, I missed 2 notes in this excerpt. Like that in some ways was the easy part because well, just do it again.
Yeah.
Right. Or we'll edit the right note in. That was the easy part. Well, not easy, but easy, not as difficult as you would expect. It's more like I'm painting a picture and it has to be exactly what I want.
Right.
Because if this phrase doesn't go exactly the way I want, someone's going to think it is what I want, and it has to be right when you're creating like a living document that someone's going to like use as a resource.
Right. Did you find that? Did you kind of find, as we were talking about talking earlier about listening to recordings and kind of finding a happy medium? Did you settle on kind of a middle of the road interpretation to put down on the recording so that it wouldn't fall too far in one direction?
For sure. I had a metronome number for every excerpt that like and a lot of times in the recording session I would, all right, I want this to be 96, and I'd click a metronome to get 96 and then play it. Which it's like, oh, like you would never do that in an audition. It's like, well, this isn't an audition. This is a recording session.
Right.
So yeah, I had these like ideal ways that I wanted it to come out, because it was a study guide. It was a resource.
Yeah.
So a lot of my preparation was a little bit different. Like with the mallet stuff, I certainly practiced, but my focus was way more on like my interpretation and what I wanted it to sound like, because I could always do a second take.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I had a great run but missed one note, we can edit that. Everybody edits that sort of stuff.
Right.
And but like if my vibraphone pedaling was perfect, I'm going to keep that.
Right.
So there was a lot of like the priorities just shifted a little bit in that regard.
Yeah. Did you find that, and not to get too into the weeds with it, but were you finding that balance between microphones, miking the instruments versus maybe miking the hall, so that you were finding that kind of that balance as well of how to get that recorded sound to be correct?
That was incredibly important. We used the engineer that recorded the orchestra, because he knew the space super well, Paul Henrich, and he's amazing and knows that space really well. But we had to, the first 45 minutes of the session was like, are we happy with this? Does this sound right?
Yeah.
We're not even recording yet. Especially the accessories were very difficult to record, because you'll see on the video I play cymbals sort of at a 45-degree angle, because we found that was the best way for the sound to hit the microphones without, like, even with good crashes, getting like the attack, too much attack.
Mm-hmm.
That you were still getting the sound of the room and the cymbals. And that's one of the big reasons that I recorded in the hall, is because, your audition's in the hall. There's plenty of people who set their phone up on a tripod and record them playing Porgy and Bess in a dry studio. And that could be useful, but it's not in the environment that you're going to perform in. So It was really critical to do it in a performance space that, like Powell, that would be where you would take an audition.
Yeah. Before we go, I wanted to ask you just about how the role of maybe a professional orchestral musician has changed. I don't know, in the last 10 to 20 years, and that you're playing a lot more popular music concerts, playing with film. I think that's happening a lot more and more. How is that shifting your job responsibilities from learning all these excerpts as we've been talking about to maybe having to learn a film score? How is that changing your job?
I mean, a lot is the short answer. I started here in 2008, closing in on, 20 years, not quite. But I remember, I think it's of something my high school teacher said once, is that, the 1800s modern strings really evolved tremendously. The violin, viola, cello, bass is really when you could, and it's obviously an overgeneralization, but modern strings really came in to be. And then in the 1900s, it was the winds, brass and winds really started to become real instruments, like modern instruments. And you could certainly say as the 19, I'm meant to say centuries. So like the 1700s, 1800s, like winds, and into the 1900s, brass specifically really became modern instruments. And then in the 1900s, certainly once you get past the 30s, percussion really became a real instrument.
Right.
And the advent of the drum set and, smarter and better percussion writing. I'm not saying that, obviously, Prokofiev and people who wrote music, in that time period, they certainly wrote really well for percussion. But in terms of a modern, true instrument, and what I'm getting at is like, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we became real musicians.
Right.
And, now, I think what you're talking about with the film score stuff and doing it live, I feel like we're in the middle of it. Like we don't know what the next evolution is. But what I will say, and I'm not trying to predict the future, but I think there is a venue for film where the live score is thought of as the movie is in production. Because I can tell you right now, it is not currently. The music is very important and critical to so many films, but it's recorded in 90-second increments and stitched together. And after the fact, scores like The Wizard of Oz or E.T. and like these classic scores, they're put together to be performed live after the fact. But it's exhausting because it was never meant to be played that way. There's no break. There's no sense of flow. It is 100% revolved around the movie, not a live performance of orchestra. And it would be interesting if a film was made, and while it was being made, it was like, not only are we going to play this in the theaters, we're going to play it like with orchestras, with like the live music is like part of the experience.
Yeah.
Because when we do a Harry Potter movie, the music is great for the movie, but in a recording session, someone was playing concert toms, and then they ended that section, and then 2 bars later, they're playing crash cymbals. And when you can edit, that's easy. But when you're playing, live with no breaks, that makes the logistics incredibly difficult. And,
right.
In those recording sessions, they'd rather hire 2 or 3 more percussionists for the speed and efficiency of the actual recording session. Whereas, in a live setting, if we can do it with 5 percussionists, like they want to do it with 5 as opposed to the 9 they did the recording session with.
Right.
So, those are the sorts of like things that have evolved where it's like, and I've tried to have conversations with the people who come in and out that do these sorts of things. But like, they're just saying that it's successful and they don't really care how it's successful.
Right. Because there's like companies that do this, right? I mean,
For sure.
They travel around with this equipment and the scores and everything.
And there's a network of principal percussionists that we have a good communication about this sort of stuff. And I think eventually we'll talk to the right person of, hey, send a reliable percussionist to score, have them go through it. And if you eliminate this 3% of additional stuff that you wrote in the score, like for the live performance, it's going to make the execution a lot easier, and no one's going to know that they're was, a bass drum on this one note as opposed to a taiko drum,
Right. Exactly.
because, that's one more instrument on stage where in a recording session, it was probably super easy to have a taiko drum there. But for a lot of orchestras, that's a $300 rental and more space on stage for one or two notes. And, does it need to
And
be
you,
there?
right, and you already have to be a gymnast as it is to be able to get around these massive setups that you probably have.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, man, that is so. This has been so informative, and I could I could just listen to you talk about your job for hours because this is so fascinating to me. I appreciate you doing this, Will.
Yeah, no problem. I made sure I had some time.
Yeah.
So if there are any last speed round, go ahead. But no, this was great.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, let me ask you one more question that I'm just curious of that I always ask of a lot of people that are teaching or because I know you've done a little bit of. Do you still teach some with? I'd seen that you do some stuff with Mizzou. Or are you teaching, doing some master class work there?
That was sort of another casualty of is this the personal life I want?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love Megan Arns, who's there, and had a great experience at University of Missouri, and but that was a couple Mondays, a month, and certainly over several Mondays over the course of a semester, where I'm getting up at 6:30 to drive out, and then not getting home until 9.
Right.
And so, if the kids are getting older, it was that became more of a priority. But no, I had a great experience there. I mean, right now I'm not doing a ton of teaching. I've got a couple students over the summer who are sort of preparing stuff. They'll come in for an hour or two. So I wouldn't say I'm not teaching, but I do not have like a traditional like weekly studio. Just it's too hard on the
Yeah.
schedule at the moment.
Yeah. I've been so interested to ask teachers about. Do you think that this new world that we're living in where content and video tutorials are available at your fingertips for anything that you want to learn how to do, if you've seen any sort of a shift in students that you teach, that I don't want to call it a cheat code, but there are some ways to maybe to find some of that information faster than when you and I were that age.
There is definitely more information, and I think if you can get to the good stuff and filter through that, you're probably right. It's probably a great resource. I think for a beginner to a moderate, advanced percussionist, weekly lessons are still going to be critical because you're going to be working on big picture technique changes and big picture music concepts that repetition and like seeing someone regularly that's going to be more beneficial. At the level of students that I'm typically teaching, I'm usually the one like, hey, I don't need to see you for 3 weeks because it's going to take you, like, you can do that work. Like I don't need to watch you practice in my studio.
Right.
And for a beginner or intermediate student, having a teacher, like, to some extent watch you practice is going to be super beneficial. Whereas their time and my time is valuable, and if they can do that work on their own, it's going to be more beneficial to them to do that work on their own rather than me just sort of like, all right, let's do it again.
Right.
you know and I find that they get more out of it, and I'm able to sort of like feed them with more information more efficiently, if I'm seeing them every 2 weeks or maybe
Yeah.
even every 3 weeks.
Yeah, I would say with those younger players, it's so crucial to make sure that they know how to practice when they're by themselves, because
Totally.
bad habits can be created quickly in those formative years of learning to play an instrument.
Yeah, and especially when you're trying to, digest a big concept or make a big change technically in how you play, consistency is super important. And that's what I've told people, like, is the biggest difference between being in school and being a professional is, like, in school, you can take 3 weeks and, like, I'm going to change this one part of my snare drum playing. And you can, like, break it down and, sort of go in reverse and, like, but, like, you can't do that in the
Right.
professional world. Like, there is no, like, hey, I mean, I guess you could do it over the summer if you really needed, like, to break something down, but, like, the level of expectation is, like, always that you will always be on. And, when you're a student, and there's a ton of value in that when you're in school, of, like, hey, I can deconstruct something and put it back together again. And that's why you're a student. That's why you're there. But, in the professional world, like, there's not that opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Man, that's great. Well, Will, I can't thank you enough for your time and just getting to hang out and talk about percussion. It's been such a pleasure getting to hang out with you today.
Absolutely. I'm glad this worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, best of luck to you. And I will, the family and I will certainly come and see you perform in the new and improved Powell Hall
Oh
very
my
soon.
gosh. Can't wait.
All right, man. Thanks a lot. Best of luck.